Hey everybody, welcome back to World History. So we're doing section 2 today. So go ahead and get your notes out. Let's get started. So again, we do have more terms and people to go over. So first one being censorship. This is restrictions on access to ideas or information. Essentially, people would use this to prevent people from seeing opposite points of view. We also have salons, or informal social gatherings at which writers, artists, and philosophers and others exchanged ideas. It was very much popularized in France first, and then it spread everywhere else. You have Baroque, which is an ornate style of art and architecture popular in the 16 and 1700s. And you have Rococo, a personal, elegant style of art and architecture made popular during the mid 1700s. We also have another term to learn, and a couple people we're going to talk about this section. We have your Enlightened Despots. Now, these are an absolute ruler who uses power to bring about political and social change. And all three of the people that are on this slide are people that were those. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joseph II of Austria. Now, Joseph II was the more radical of the three, and he worked for religious equality and an end to censorship as well. But I think we'll talk about that in a minute. So, our essential question. As Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe, what cultural and political changes took place? Well, the Enlightenment brought cultural changes as writers, artists, and musicians spread new ideas. Even absolute monarchs in Europe became enlightened despots by granting greater freedoms in their realms. So, really, when we talk about the Enlightenment, if you remember last, when we did the Renaissance, we talked about the birthplace of the Renaissance being in Florence, Italy. France is very much the heart and birthplace of the Enlightenment, and the ideas spread across Europe from there. Now, these new ideas did create challenges to the rulers of the day. More people came to believe that reform was necessary to achieve a just society versus than just sticking with the status quo. Now, most government and church authorities felt they had a sacred duty to defend the old order of divine right rule in strict social classes. Now, the most common defense was through censorship of writers and books, and writers fought back by disguising their ideas in fiction. Voltaire's Candide exposed corruption and hypocrisy in a fiction novel. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels satirized 18th century England and went after some of those issues. And Montesquieu's Persian letters mocked French society. So they found a way to get around that censorship by just hiding it in plain sight. So, ideas spread through salons, as well as books and pamphlets, and in the 1600s, a group of noble women in Paris began inviting a few friends to their homes for poetry readings. By the 1700s, some middle-class women began holding salons as well. Now, the most respected salons hosted writers and musicians such as Diderot and Mozart as well. Now, the arts also evolved. It's important to note that. In the age of Louis XIV, courtly art and architecture were grand and opulent, reflecting the lives of saints and glorious battles. This was the era of the Baroque style, as seen in the decor of the Palace at Versailles. The court of Louis XV was much less formal. This was reflected in the Rococo style. Artists moved away from the heavy splendor to light, elegant, and charming subjects, more so a picturesque style of art. Now, this style was heavily criticized by the philosophers as superficial, and was very popular among the upper and middle classes. This is the beginning of those issues that we'll see come to a head during the French Revolution. As in art, music also evolved, and an elegant new classical style emerged. This is where we get classical music as we know it today. You have people like Bach and Handel, who wrote pieces for the organ and choirs, as well as 30 operas. You have Franz Joseph Haydn, who developed a string quartet and symphony. And of course, Mozart, you've all heard of Mozart before, created operas, symphonies, and religious music that defined the new style of composition. Now, Haydn, he's an interesting character, him, because did you know after he died, people stole his head? Yes, that's right, folks. People wanted to have the head of a famous musician sitting on a shelf in their home. And it transferred hands to like 3 separate people. If you guys want, I do have a video that I could show you all on that later. Literature also evolved, and middle class readers liked stories about their own times told in a straightforward language. This really made for an outpouring of novels or long works of prose fiction. One of the most famous is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, and this was an exciting tale about a sailor shipwrecked on a tropical island. Now, absolute monarchs who adopted or accepted the Enlightenment ideas, again, like I said earlier, became enlightened despots. And these monarchs applied these ideas to their governments, included Frederick the Great of Prussia, which is right here, which is what would become Germany, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Joseph II of Austria. So, the ideas of the philosophers actually convinced some rulers that reform was necessary. So Frederick the Great, we'll start here. He actually reduced the use of torture in Prussia, allowed for a free press, and tolerated religious differences, which was huge, coming from a monarch, especially in that region. If you remember, Prussia was in that same region that we talked about that reacted rather negatively to Martin Luther in the 95 Thesis and the Reformation last unit. Then we have Catherine the Great in Russia, who flat out altogether gets rid of torture, established religious tolerance, granted nobles a charter of their rights, and criticized the institution of serfdom that had continued in Russia, bringing about its end, actually. And you have Joseph II of Austria. Now, he modernized Austria's government massively. He was the radical one of the three rulers we're talking about. He supported religious equality for Jews and Protestants, ended censorship altogether, and abolished serfdom in its entirety. So realistically, the Enlightenment brought about a massive amount of changes for Austria. Now, while they implemented these reforms, they didn't give up their own power. Frederick the Great desired a strong monarchy and more power for himself. Catherine the Great refused to give up power and aggressively expanded the Russian Empire. And Joseph II, even though he was the more radical one of the three, implemented many changes, but most were canceled after his death, so really they didn't happen. So, most Europeans were actually completely untouched by the Enlightenment and new cultural movements. The majority remained peasants in small rural villages. However, by the late 1700s, ideas about equality and social justice had finally reached them, and these ideas sowed the seeds for political upheaval in the 1800s. So that's it for notes for today. So what you're going to complete now is the Chapter 17 web quest. I'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.